For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started. All right, guys, looks like we are live. And I know this is late, but I figured this way people will have an interesting stream to listen to in the morning. I'm going to try my best, guys, to cover quite a lot of information in just about an hour. We'll see how that goes, because I've said that before in the past, and we've gone 3-4 hours. So, but I want you guys to see, and you are going to see throughout this this program today, okay, just how good, just how exceptional the critics are at dodging the evidence, dodging the arguments, dodging the data. Okay, and you're also going to see why critics such as Dr. Dan Stern Cardinale comes to mind, Evograd, Team Dodgeball. Okay, these critics that are ducking, dodging, okay, dipping, diving all over the place, okay? They're not taken seriously, and you're going to see why. And they have been seriously refuted. I mean, it's not even funny, to be honest with you. So they've run out of arguments. They've run out of responses, okay? And a couple announcements, though, before I get this going. We're going to touch on accelerated nuclear decay, the so-called heat problem. We're going to talk about creationist testable predictions. We're going to go over why the evolutionists themselves have failed so miserably to present any testable predictions of their own, especially when it comes to genetics, which is the direct way to determine ancestry, to answer this question of ancestry, universal ancestry or separate ancestry. So we've got some good people in the chat, even at 3:30 in the morning. So I appreciate that. We've got Jamie Russell. Good to see you, brother. George Bond in the house, the man who's putting my kids through college. So, George, I appreciate you being here. And George makes some good points already. Yes, we're going to be touching on that. As a matter of fact, I think I'm going to start with that topic, okay? I'm going to start with the so-called heat problem. I'm going to start with evidence for accelerated nuclear decay, because it's incredibly important, especially because the critics have been dodging so hard. And if you haven't yet seen my recent discussion debate on the heat problem with critic David Neff, please check that out, because I think that thoroughly demonstrated why there exists a number of very plausible explanations for getting rid of that heat, okay? And let's see who else is in the chat. Gangster Ghost says, would you debate Aaron Ra? Yes, I would. I would debate any of these evolutionists that are willing to defend their philosophy in a live debate. So I've had about 100 of them, and I've debated a lot more intelligent evolutionists than Aaron Ra. So certainly I would. Anyways, let's get right into it. Actually, I want to do a couple announcements. So this week, Thursday, make sure you're here. We've got Joseph Hubbard, who's going to be here again. We're going to be refuting the critics. We're going to be tackling the ordering of the fossil record. We're going to be demolishing Gutsick Gibbons' video on limestone. And then we are going to be doing a rapid fire Q&A. Okay, so make sure you are here this Thursday. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then on the Friday, we got the round 2 debate between David Neff and Nephilim Free on the global flood. So that's definitely going to be one to remember as well. March 3rd, we just confirmed Matt Slick versus Derek Barnes, secular morality versus Christian morality. So that's going to be a lot of fun as well. Lots to look forward to, guys. Also on the channel titled Young Earth Creation, check it out, because one of our videos have gone viral. It's at like 250,000 views right now. And the alternative channel, which is Raw Matt's channel, it's been retitled to Young Earth Creation, where we are we are re-uploading every single video that we put out on this channel, on that channel. It's already close to 5,000 subscribers. So the more channels, the better. And the more channels that we can put out this information and reach as many people as possible, the better as well. So lots to look forward to. Anyways, let's get right into this, guys. I want to point out a couple things before I get into some clips. I got some video clips. I'm going to be screen sharing. We're going to make this interactive. Brother Jamie Russell, I did get your file. I just have to open it. And if that's what I'm going to be seeing, I'm excited. So I appreciate it. I appreciate everybody and their support. Everybody and their support is the reason why we are able to do this full time and put out full-time content. Essentially every single day we're putting out something, interviews, discussions, debates. So I appreciate all your support. Okay, so before I forget though, and because George brought up some great points, I want to touch on the so-called heat problem. Okay, especially because we should want to press the critic, okay, on the empirical evidence that they avoid over and over again. Okay, and this was evident in my recent discussion or debate on this topic, okay, because I pointed out a number of lines of evidence directly in the rocks that demonstrate accelerated nuclear decay has occurred in the past, okay? For example, fission tracks, radio halos, and helium. And I want to touch on all three of these, but I want to touch on helium in great detail, okay? And I also want to point out before we move on here that the critics, all their best rescue devices, all their best arguments have actually been demolished by us here on this channel with many PhD scientists. I mean, we've had Dr. Sarfati, Professor McQueen, Dr. Jason Lyle, who have been on this channel absolutely demolishing the rescue devices that the critics have when it comes to these lines of evidence, demonstrating a young Earth and demonstrating accelerated nuclear decay. So before we get that started, any critics want to rebut this, they got a lot of work to do with our previous videos, okay? So, George has some more good points. Yeah, we're going to be touching on a ton here, guys. So what I want to say is both the fission tracks and the radio halos. Okay, let's start with those two observations. Both of these direct lines of evidence in the rocks themselves, okay? As I pointed out, that accelerated nuclear decay has occurred. We literally have the scars. Okay, we have the scars of this. And I pointed this out to David Neff in our previous debate. I've pointed this out to Gutsick Gibbon in our debates, especially in our third debate, with no rebuttal to these lines of evidence. Okay, so the fact is we actually have the scars themselves in the rocks, okay, that this has occurred. Now, here's the problem for the critic, okay? Here's the problem for the critic is when it comes to this so-called heat problem, okay, we know that when we actually heat a rock, okay, and I'm looking at the chat here. Yeah, that's, okay. Awesome, Jamie. And some more good points from George, which we're going to touch on, okay? So I want to point this out, okay, guys? So listen closely. When we actually heat up a rock, okay, the damage in the crystal actually repairs itself. And what this results in is the obliteration, okay, the literal obliteration of the damage. In other words, what I'm saying is the radio halo and the fission tracks would be totally obliterated, okay? Dr. Andrew Snelling, he's actually pointed to an example in, I believe it was in Los Alamos, okay, where they had a drill hole. And what they noticed was that as you go down, okay, the more you go down, you go through granite, where you can actually see these halos. These halos are incredibly evident, okay? They can be observed. And the more you go down in depth, the in situ temperature actually increases. And when you get to about 150 degrees Celsius, guess what happens? Okay, well, you're right. The radio halos actually fade away. They disappear. Okay, and this is what George was touching on in the chat. Okay, these radio halos disappear because of the heat. the rise in temperature. And the reason why, okay, and this is well known, the reason why is because the heat has actually energized the crystal to the point where the particles of the crystalline structure, it's actually repaired itself, okay? And what the point is, okay, is that if there were no rapid cooling, let's say during the flood, okay, during the flood event, then the heat that the critics constantly point to, okay, the heat that the critics constantly say would have melted the crust and boiled the ocean, they actually say that this heat, okay, this heat problem alone completely refutes the Genesis flood. It precludes the Genesis flood. Well, here's the thing. If there were no rapid cooling during the flood, okay, then here's the thing. We would not have this evidence from radio halos and fission tracks because they would have been obliterated based on this heat. We would not have this evidence for accelerated nuclear decay because these are scars in the rocks. We know that accelerated nuclear decay has occurred. We have the evidence. We have the observations. Okay, there's no doubt about that. Therefore, the amount of heat that they purport would make the Genesis flood impossible. Okay, it must not have been a problem, as in all these lines of evidence that we have discussed, okay, in the past, that I discussed in the debate, okay, and these supercooling mechanisms would have had to be the case since we have the evidence directly observed in the rocks, okay? So, those reasons, very plausible reasons as to how most of that heat could have been dumped into space are very, very plausible. And they don't want to deal with this evidence, okay? And I want to talk about helium, okay? Because this is an irrefutable line of evidence. Good to see you, Luca. Good to see you, Brother Otangelo. Okay. So let me talk about helium real quick. And I'm going to explain this in a nutshell, but kind of go through the steps because it can be kind of technical, okay? So when uranium decays, guys, it actually goes through a series of steps. And the byproduct of these steps is a helium atom, okay? And every time a uranium atom would then decay, let's look to, say, a zircon crystal, okay? This decay would actually produce helium atoms. And so this helium would be sitting around in the zircon crystals. And they can actually slip around to the point where they eventually leak out completely. And this is the problem the critic faces, okay? Is the fact that helium atoms are incredibly tiny and they have no reason to actually hang around. Okay, now if we did have accelerated nuclear decay, okay, as the young Earth creation model would suggest, then we would actually expect to find what? Well, we would expect to find plenty of helium in these zircon crystals. As guess what? They would not have had enough time to decay. And so when the rate scientists themselves, okay, when they looked at zircon crystals, all at great depths too, okay, what they discovered was helium in these zircon crystals. Now, here's the thing. If these crystals really were 1 billion or more years old, then most of the helium would have slipped out, okay? But if these crystals only go back thousands of years, okay, to creation and the flood, then most of the helium should still be present. And yet this is what we find. Substantial amounts of helium in zircon crystals that are said to be 1 billion years or older by the uniformitarians, okay? And here's the thing. I want to point this out that the evolutionists would agree because they set this standard that it comes down to testable and falsifiable predictions. And there were predictions made before the analyses, okay, before the analyses of these numerous crystals, numerous samples they looked at. And when the data was received, okay, what they discovered was helium quantities fully in line with rapid nuclear decay, fully in line with global flood expectations, fulfilled predictions, okay? And these scoffers and the critics in these blogs have tried to attack the rate team and Dr. Russell Humphreys, and they've dealt with all of these arguments. Okay, none of these arguments are peer reviewed. I mean, this is empirical evidence directly in the rocks for accelerated nuclear decay, all in line with flood accelerated nuclear decay. Okay. Jamie Russell says, yes, lots of helium in the higher parts of the atmosphere. That as well. Brother Montas says dodgeball. Yes, they are master dodgeball players, and Dr. Dodgeball Dan himself deserves the MVP. I think I'm going to give it to him. Okay. So helium, fission tracks, radio halos. The radio halos and fission tracks shouldn't even be there if there was this immense amount of heat that would have boiled the oceans and melted the crust. Okay, no, that heat would have obliterated the fission tracks and the radio halos. Okay, so no. Okay, this heat problem is no longer a valid argument based on the observable evidence that we have today in the rocks. Now we can discuss plausible mechanisms for how the Earth could have been supercooled, how most of the heat could have been dumped into space, how the fact is most of the heat may still be in the Earth's core today. Heat and energy, okay, and I've said this many times, are not a bug when it comes to the flood. It's a feature. You need heat and energy to get the plates moving, for example. Okay, heat and energy are a good thing. And these lines of evidence that we see directly in the rocks are a good thing as well. And that being said, I want to talk about catastrophic plate tectonics and the testable predictions that have. So George Bond says the helium prediction was made and published 5 years before. Exactly. Testable and falsifiable predictions over and over again being fulfilled by young Earth creationists in genetics, biology, astronomy, geology. Okay. I wasn't going to talk about this. I was going to go right into catastrophic plate tectonics, but you know what? Let's just give the final blow yet again, okay? Because George, Professor McQueen, and I are going to be talking about carbon, radiocarbon found in diamonds. This is another fatal blow. This is another fatal blow to uniformitarianism and old age thinking, okay? Radiocarbon. Well, carbon decays so rapidly, so quickly that let's say if every single atom in the universe, okay? Let's say every single atom in the universe was made of carbon. It would then decay. It would all decay within 1 million years, easily. This is without question. So if the rocks and the fossils that the evolutionists point to were really millions of years old, they would have no carbon left. Evolutionists explain how this is possible. This is why the evolutionists, the uniformitarians, won't use carbon dating to date rocks assumed to be this old, okay? Or they won't use radiocarbon dating to date fossils, coal, oil, okay, things like this. But we actually know, okay? It's a fact. Montaz says, SFT is a nocturnal Evo slayer. Yes. I think best at night. And I'm thinking all day about how much the evolutionists and the critics are dodging the evidence, the empirical evidence. So late at night when everybody's sleeping, I know that I got to get in here and I got to expose the dodging. And I have to take people like Dr. Dodgeball, Dan Stern Cardinale, and let them know, listen, your dodgeball skills are phenomenal. And you've earned the MVP for this. Okay, and this is why they can't address any of this evidence, okay, is the fact that we know that radiocarbon exists in all sorts of fossils. Radiocarbon is found in fossilized wood, it's found in diamonds, it's found in coal, okay? And the RATE team, they sent all sorts of samples to be tested. Samples ranging from tens of millions of years old to hundreds of millions of years old. And guess what? Oh, Tangelo says he just woke up. Yeah. Otangelo is just starting his day, and our nights are just winding down. Well, I appreciate you tuning in this morning, brother Otangelo. You're an evolutionist destroyer, so I appreciate you anytime you're in the chat. So here's the thing. They sent a number of samples, not just one, not just two, no, a wide range of samples, all assumed by the uniformitarians to be different ages, okay, tens of millions to hundreds of millions of years old, essentially. And guess what? They all came back. They all came back the exact same age. They all had radiocarbon in them. That's a problem for the evolutionist. Can I get a sound check, guys, too? Let me know how the audio is. Make sure we're good. So all of these samples had radiocarbon in them. Massive problem for the uniformitarian that our critics, okay, especially Team Dodgeball, have not dealt with. And one thing they'll try and say is, you know, these samples were contaminated. Well, contamination doesn't work as a rescue device, okay? All of these things have been looked at. All of these rescue devices that they point to have been considered, okay, by these PhD scientists. These results are repeatable. They're testable. You can make predictions, okay, that come back confirmed, okay? Dinosaur bones come back with the radiocarbon, fossils, coal, diamonds, fossilized wood, everything. It's not just one or two anomalies. No, you know, these are massive numbers of samples that the evolutionists, the uniformitarians, assume should not be the case. And that's it. The evolutionists are pointing to these rocks and fossils that are apparently millions and millions of years old, and yet we find plenty of carbon in them. We find radio hills and fission tracks, the scars in the rocks themselves that accelerated nuclear decay has occurred. Okay. We find helium in zircon crystals that should not be there if the Earth was billions of years old. George Bond makes a good point. He says, heavier elements should be evenly distributed throughout the Earth's surface, but we find 90% in the dry land mass. Great point, brother. Great point. I'm going to end it with this, okay? Because this is another argument that the critics just do not want to deal with, okay? And I've been using this argument and going over this testable prediction for a couple of years now since I've been debating. I used this against Godless Engineer about a year ago in my debate, and he just could not grasp the fact that the flood model makes testable predictions. Speed of sound. Speed of sound. I haven't seen him put forth an actual rebuttal or argument in... well, really, since the existence of his channel. I mean, his arguments against the continental sprint during the flood were pretty much just to scoff at, but not actually make any testable predictions of his own and not actually address the confirmed prediction based on catastrophic plate tectonics. Okay, listen, we know the plates are moving. We can observe this. We know this. Nobody disagrees with this. The continents are moving very slowly today, very slowly. But the question is, can these snail-paced geological movements, okay, explain the geological features of the Earth today? And the answer is no. The answer is no. That's why they don't have any answer to this. Not even your evolutionary geologists. Okay, there's a reason why all of these critics are so hesitant to debate Dr. Steve Austin, debate Joseph Hubbard, debate Professor McQueen. We have a number of geology experts, okay, associated with Team Standing for Truth that are willing to debate these guys, but they won't do it because uniformitarianism and actualism are not defendable, okay? The answer is no. Present day geological processes cannot explain the features of the Earth today, okay? They just can't. When it comes to the flood model, guys, we're no longer looking at continental drift. What we're looking at is continental sprint. And what this model predicts, because the critics, they'll scoff, right? Okay, well, if it comes down to testability and predictability and falsifiability, let's make a prediction then. Okay. This flood geology model predicts that the pre-flood ocean crust would be dragged down, okay? Dragged down into the mantle in a process we all know of as subduction, okay? So these plates are being subducted. And since this happened, according to our model, just a few thousand years ago, we would predict that this cold ocean crust should still be cold today, even though we know it has actually descended into the deep hot mantle, okay? Now, modern seismologists, after this prediction was made by Dr. John Baumgartner, okay? After this prediction was made, modern seismologists have discovered that there are indeed huge cold slabs of rock, okay? And these are found down near the core itself in areas that should have warmed up or melted, completely melted, if millions of years worth of time are what actually brought those slabs down, okay? Instead of the global flood of Noah, instead of catastrophic plate tectonics, okay? Because I've used this analogy before, okay? In order to buckle the rock strata enough to uplift these mountains, okay, you would need meters per second movement of the plates. Okay, because if you've got two cars coming at each other at 100 kilometers an hour, what you will get is that type of buckling. If you've got two cars coming at each other at 1 kilometer an hour, you're not going to get much buckling. Just like what we see today, the snail pace movements of the plates could not result in the necessary buckling of the strata to uplift those mountains. Okay, our model can explain this. Catastrophic plate tectonics can explain this, and we've made a prediction. And this prediction has been confirmed. And the evolutionists, for example, Gutsa Gibbon attempted to respond to it in her 3.5-hour video, and it was no response at all. George and I demolished it in our response to it. So problem after problem for these evolutionary uniformitarians, okay? What we see on this planet when it comes to geology is evidence after evidence of the global flood, okay? We see rapid or no erosion between sediment layers. We see whole rock layer sequences literally deposited rapidly in quick succession, continent-wide, okay? Continent-wide rock layer sequences, all requiring water, rapidly moving water, okay? And we've got these rock layers that are bent without fracturing, which means they would have had to just been deposited. And it's just the line of evidence after just fossils in general. Fossils in general require rapid burial. We've got testable predictions, okay? Even the evolutionary uniformitarians would have to admit that the evidence is pretty clear that the Earth was once completely underwater. They'll just say, you know, underwater at different times as compared to one big giant flood, okay? But no, CPT makes testable predictions, okay? And all these observations are in accord with the flood of Noah, covering the entire Earth just a few thousand years ago. So I didn't want to touch too much on that, because I did want to move into the main topic, which is genetics and testable predictions. So that being the case, I do want to screen share here real quick. George Bond says, out of order fossils. Yes. We're going to be discussing that on Thursday with Joseph Hubbard. So bring your questions, guys, all your geology related questions related to creation versus evolution. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So anyways, I'm going to screen share here and show you just how it's going to lag a bit here because I'm screen sharing. Give it 1 second. Okay. Now I want to show you. Give me an audio check when you can. Oh. Okay. Now, if you really want to see how desperate these critics are, okay, guys, go watch our rebuttal. Ramat and myself, we did a rebuttal to Dr. Dan Stern Cardinale, okay? And then David Neff and Dr. Dan attempted to respond. I joined, okay? And I debated Dr. Dan for over an hour. And the best he could provide was a retrodiction, no actual testable predictions. He's asking for the numbers when the numbers fit perfectly with our model of independent origins, and it's them who don't have the numbers, which is why they have to retrofit the data into their evolutionary fairy tale, into their evolutionary story, okay? He could not account for why there are so few differences between any two people when it comes to not only the mitochondrial DNA, but also the Y chromosome. Couldn't explain away the fast pedigree-based mutation rate in both the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA. Now, he wants to say that genetic drift and evolutionary mechanisms such as natural selection, we all agree with natural selection, okay? And creationists account for substantial amounts of purifying selection, okay? But we've discussed this over and over again, okay? So that's why it comes down to testable predictions, which have actually been confirmed. They're being tested right now. Okay, and I covered this in that debate with Dr. Dan, and he didn't give any response, any rebuttal to these predictions in terms of the history of civilization and genetic stamps and genetic signatures found in the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. Dr. Dan and Evograd and these critics say that they've read Replacing Darwin, and I believe that they probably had read it, possibly blindfolded, because all of these predictions are directly in the pages of that book. I've recently reread a couple of those chapters where Jeanson makes those predictions on the history of civilization and genetic stamps in the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA. They must have skipped those parts. Otangelo says, write a book on the geological evidence of the flood. That would be great. You know, that I think that is in order, because I've now written 3 or 4 on the genetic related evidence, and I'd love to go into detail in regards to the evidence for accelerated nuclear decay, evidence from geology for the flood, including testable predictions, because they can't rebut the testable predictions. Predictions made, predictions confirmed years later. I mean, they can retrofit the data at that point, which they do with the cold slabs. Doesn't change the fact that creationists predicted it and it was found. Okay, so Dr. Dan Stern Cardinale here, this is what he says. Okay, he said this in a post recently, and we're going to cover this in great detail because this is just funny. You know, these guys, it's just becoming laughable. They're making it so easy. Okay, so D. Stern Cardinale says, is Jeanson going to, I don't know, test any of the predictions that he's made? He's hypothesized some pretty out there stuff. Then he goes over the predictions in mutation rates in Africans. He says it'd be great if he would test any of that stuff before churning out another for general audiences book. This is why nobody takes people like Dan seriously. This is why he's easy to refute. He came in for pure damage control, and he was supposed to be the man. He was supposed to save the day, and he ruined the day for the critics, okay? Of course, he's not going to tap out, so he's going to repeat the same talking point over and over again, no matter how many times that talking point has been absolutely demolished, okay? Which is fine, but everybody can see that he's got egg on his face. I mean, this is just a few days ago, and he's still repeating the same talking point, okay? That hopefully just corrects himself one day. So, that being said, I want to go over a few of Dr. Jeanson's predictions in terms of the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA, which he laid out beautifully in Replacing Darwin, which these critics say that they've read, but they can't deal with the confirmed predictions. They can't make predictions of their own. So that's why they have to pretend that these predictions are not being tested and are not being confirmed, okay? Because when it comes to genetic stamps and the history of civilization in, say, the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, according to deep time evolutionary history, it would mostly be noise. As compared to the young Earth creation model, it would mostly be signature. And yet we are detecting genetic signatures showing that contrary to the rescue devices of these critics such as Dan, the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA only go back maximum 6,000 years, 4,500 years for the Y chromosome to Y chromosome Noah. But they don't want to deal with it. They just want to pass off retrodictions as if they were testable predictions, or they want to look to these substitution rates and purifying selection and genetic drift as if they can save the day, when they cannot, because they're not resulting in testable predictions. Okay, so here's an article that Jeanson just put out. The ultimate scientific rebuttal to Darwin's descent of man. Okay, so I'm going to go over this because I went over these predictions numerous times, and it's in one ear and out the other with the critics. Okay, so Jeanson says, and we'll follow along here. In other words, for creation science to overturn descent of man, creationists will need to propose falsifiable predictions related to the origin of mankind, right? Meet the gold standard. Okay, so let's go over this. When I wrote the book Replacing Darwin in 2017, this was the standard I sought to meet. Replacing Darwin contains numerous testable predictions. And remember, Dan, being the ignorant critic that he is, says that these predictions are not being tested, okay? Which is just ridiculous. Which is why these types of critics will not face Dr. Jeanson and hold themselves accountable, okay, in the AIG journal like Dr. Frello has done, which I highly recommend reading that written debate. This is why they won't do it, because they know they'll get called out and get demolished. Luckily, they have us here at Team Standing for Truth, which will call out all of their numerous errors. Okay, so one in particular, Jeanson points out, applied directly to the question of human origins. Let's see if these have been tested, contrary to the critics. Let's see. The young Earth creation anthropology that I just outlined makes another prediction. Since my model traces the origin of nearly all the common DNA variants back to Adam and Eve, my model suggests that the history of civilization can be read off the nuclear DNA differences. One category of DNA differences, of course, among the peoples of the globe, and on a time scale consistent with the young Earth creation model. For example, in the last few hundred years, European colonization and the transatlantic slave trade have resulted in major geographic movements of peoples around the globe. These movements will leave a signature in the genetics of each peoples. I also articulated these claims with respect to a specific type of nuclear DNA that is inherited only in males, the Y chromosome. Oh, I want to point out, okay? So, Gutzit Gibbon and Joshua Stramidas, they attempted to rebut Dr. Jeanson's confirmed predictions on the Y chromosome, and it was an epic failure. Misrepresentations, straw man arguments, misunderstandings of Y chromosome pedigree-based studies and how many there are that exist versus whole genome pedigree-based studies, omitting a ton of papers, a ton of data. It was bad. So we destroyed that video, and Dan attempted a blind rebuttal to our video, okay? Because Gutzit Gibbon and Joshua Stramidas cannot address the arguments that we put forth demolishing their video, okay? And his blind rebuttal was just the funniest thing I've ever seen. So I'll put it in the description box. I did a full rebuttal, a couple hours long, to his video, showing that he has no answer to these confirmed predictions that he say doesn't exist. He wants to pretend. Right? It's pretend with the evolutionists, pretend bacteria and whales are related kind of thing. Okay, so let's see here. Thus, both. So here's the point. Any possible rebuttal that you like that, George? Any possible rebuttal that these guys could come up with, right? It's just going to be either the same talking point we've already demolished. We've shown demonstrably, okay, and sufficiently that their arguments against these Y chromosome and these genetic stamp related predictions, they can't deal with them. They can only ignore or misrepresent. Okay, so know that any possible rebuttal, it's been dealt with in great detail. Okay, so thus both the mitochondrial DNA a type of DNA inherited through the female line. And the Y chromosome sequences have the potential to act. Remember, these are predictions made by Dr. Jeanson before they've been confirmed. Okay, so remember this. Potential to act as strict, absolute molecular clocks. The rate of mutation in each of these compartments will determine how precisely each can measure time. But the fact of a clock is true in both compartments. Therefore, the timing of the origin and migration of various people groups can be interrogated with these genetic tools. The Y chromosome differences among modern humans represent, in theory, the first type of nuclear DNA signature of the history of civilization. When Dr. Jeanson, and I was rewatching the debate today, when he attempted to debate these predictions with Dr. Herman Mayes in their debate on Non Sequitur show, Herman Mayes resorted to a straw man. He had months and months to prepare for that debate. And he said, well, nuclear genetic sequences, okay, based on coalescence, goes back farther than mitochondrial DNA sequences, okay? And Dr. Jeanson said, what does my book say about nuclear DNA? Because we explain the vast majority of nuclear DNA differences as created nuclear heterozygosity, right? Which is why the uniparentally inherited DNA compartments like the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA are the best DNA compartments to examine and analyze when it comes to answering this question of ancestry. And Dr. Mayes could not reiterate that important point that nobody could miss from replacing Darwin. So this is what we're dealing with, is straw man arguments and misrepresentations from these guys, okay? Because if any critic on this channel who's been following us for any more than a week doesn't know that we have a starting position of created nuclear heterozygosity, which makes testable predictions on DNA function, okay, and other predictions as well. But if they don't recognize that by now, then obviously they're not paying attention, okay? So George says, where's Dodgeball Dan's predictions? They don't exist. The paper that he provided, okay, was nothing more than a retrodiction, still based on uniformitarian assumptions and deep time assumptions and assumptions when it comes to human and chimp split. Okay, well, whenever I show those phylogenetic trees when it comes to mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome, you can see, okay, you can see that some people are picking up more mutations in the same amount of time than their cousins, which means you can't look to humans and chimpanzees and look to the number of DNA differences that separate them and make assumptions as to how long ago they split. Because when they do that and they look to a phylogenetic rate, they come up with a rate that's extremely slow, way slower than the fast mutation rate that we see today. Okay, and the fact that the mutation rate that we see today is fast in these DNA compartments, and the DNA differences that separate any two people in the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA is few, okay, there's very, very low genetic variation in the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. This means humanity is young. That's the only way to explain a fast mutation rate with very few differences separating any two people, okay? And because there are such few DNA differences separating any two people, guess what? That means young Earth creationists can account for massive amounts of purifying selection, which, by the way, these critics say young Earth creationists ignore. When in fact, no, we fully acknowledge the role of purifying selection, of natural selection. The numbers are in line with our expectations and our model. They're the ones that need to retrofit the data according to the numbers. No, they're the ones that need to show the numbers, and they're the ones that cannot show the numbers. It's assumptions after assumptions after assumptions, just as Orient Express has stated. So because of that rant, I'm going to have a drink of water here. Okay, so here we go. Here's the meat and potatoes, guys. Dr. Jeanson points out, since then, I've published 3 papers. Guys, not 1, not 2, but 3 papers that have directly confirmed these predictions for the Y chromosome. Now, remember, Stramidas and Erica attempted a rebuttal. They failed. We demolished the rebuttal. Dan attempted a blind rebuttal. We demolished that blind rebuttal. They have no answer for these confirmed predictions. And yet 6 days ago, Dr. Dan was still repeating the talking point that will Jeanson, Dr. Jeanson, ever test his predictions? They've been tested. And guess what? 3 published papers confirming the predictions. And guess what? This research program is essentially a substitution rate study, which Dr. Dan always wants to talk about the substitution rate, which is fine. There are few substitutions as well. Substitutions are perfectly in line with the young Earth creation model, but this research program is essentially a substitution rate analysis, okay? 3 published papers, and Brother Otangelo, yes, I will. You know what I'll do? I'll put them in the description box as well, and I'll send them to you. Okay, so let's keep going. Now, the only rebuttal Dan can have, okay, Dodgeball Dan, is that Jeanson is lying, or he's making this up. I mean, looks like the critics are now invoking the conspiracy. I mean, this is why they've failed miserably. And this is why all they can do is dodge. All they can do is duck, dip, dive, and dodge. That's it. That's all they can do. I don't blame them. You know, they got a lot invested in their belief that banana plants, whales, man, and puppy dogs are related through common ancestry. They got a lot invested in that belief. Okay. So of course they're not going to tap out or provide their own predictions. No, they're going to invoke a conspiracy. Dr. Jeanson didn't really confirm his predictions. So we're just going to say in the Peaceful Science blog, which is anything but peaceful and also consists of the worst arguments on the internet. And if this is their best, guys, then this should give you incredible confidence, okay, that their best have no rebuttal, have no argument other than talking points, misrepresentations, and straw man arguments. That should give you a lot of confidence that they're bringing in damage control, and the damage control has nothing to offer, guys. And you can see that too when it comes to our fellow warriors in the faith, like Brother Otangelo. You know, he'll jump in and he'll debate 10 evolutionists at once, and he'll debate PhDs. Okay, for example, Dr. Demeter. And they got nothing against Otangelo. He's going in there in the lion's den and he's taking on 10 of them, and they got nothing. That's why they have to dodge. So, I mean, you know, it's 2021 and it's a great time to be an intelligent design advocate, great time to be a biblical creationist, I'm telling you, because we've got the predictions, they don't got the predictions, and the best they got have easily refuted talking points, okay? So let me continue this, guys. With this precedent in hand, in spring and summer of 2020, I began to explore the global ramifications of these findings. I looked for the signatures of human history, right, based on his testable predictions that, according to Dan, have not been tested. I mean, is he reading these papers blindfolded? I mean, you can't really make this stuff up, guys. You can't make this stuff up. And that's why I'm glad that this information is getting out to so many people. I mean, our video on the flood is at like 250,000 views. Okay. And, you know, more and more people are finding the channel, and the number of our books that have gone out in the last few months is overwhelming. It's amazing. It's amazing how many people are benefiting from our work, and all the glory to God. All the glory goes to him. Okay. He didn't have to give us all this amazing evidence, okay? Because it's by faith we are saved. And yet he gave us so much evidence, as Otangelo says. The evidence for creation is overwhelming. Amen. Amen. It's undeniable. They are willingly ignorant. They are willingly ignorant. So, Dr. Jeanson says, I looked for the signatures of human history in the DNA of people all around the globe. You can find the results of this early search. So he did a video series. It's like 28 parts. very technical series going over his discoveries. Since airing the initial results in a video series, I've been working intensely on the remaining signatures. See, this is what I mean when I say this is an active research program. Predictions have been made, and it's years and years worth of work and time and energy and effort, okay, to actually study and detect these signatures. And every single year now, okay, since the release of these predictions, we're getting more and more amazing, fascinating results. These results have been stunning. For example, we now know that most people of European descent came from Central Asia in the AD era. Also, much of sub-Saharan Africa looks like it's linked to ancient Egypt. Modern Polynesians might also have their origins in ancient Africa. These and other findings will be released this summer / fall in a book. The current title is The Hidden History of Humankind. Another fatal blow, guys, to evolutionary theory. Unexpected links among ancient civilizations. In the book, I will be exploring the rise and fall of 8 ancient civilizations or peoples: ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Persia, ancient Israel, ancient India, ancient China, the Eastern Islanders, and the Native Americans. Guys, okay, we are retracing human history because the signature is reflection of that maximum 6,000 year of human history, 4,500 years since the flood and the repopulation of humanity from 3 reproducing couples, okay? So those phylogenetic trees that only reflect a few thousand years and not hundreds of thousands of years, guess what? It turns out that the evolutionists like Dan are wrong with their rescue device of substitution rates, natural selection, genetic drift, because guess what? It is the creationists that are making testable predictions, and it's the creationists that are able to detect these genetic signatures, genetic stamps in the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA. And guess what? That amount of signature should not be there, okay? If deep time evolutionary history is true, it should be mostly noise. It should be mostly noise, but it's not, okay? It's bad for them. With modern genetics, I will then try to answer the questions that most history books never address. Who did these people come from? And what happened to them after their civilizations fell? In answering these questions for these 8 peoples, I end up telling the story of the whole world. Effectively, this book fulfills. Remember, Dr. Dan, who nobody takes seriously anymore, is still repeating the talking point that Dr. Jeanson is not going about testing his predictions. This is why Dr. Jeanson looks at people like Dr. Dan or Evograd, okay? Looks at these guys and he just shrugs them off and he says more misrepresentations, more straw man arguments. That's why they're so easy to refute. I mean, Dr. Dan's got a PhD in evolutionary biology, and look at this. I mean, it's sad. Effectively, this book fulfills the testable predictions I made several years ago. In doing so, it meets the decades-old demands of the evolutionary community that the evolutionary community, apparently, guys, is pretending doesn't exist. The book does science. It advances our knowledge of the natural world. Rather than simply identify the shortcomings of evolution, it confirms testable predictions that I made in the past. Let me read that, guys, because people like Dr. Dan, they have to invoke conspiracy. Oh, Dr. Jeanson didn't actually confirm his predictions. He's making all this up. That's no argument. Maybe it's an argument to Team Dodgeball, but it's not an argument to any rational thinking person. Let me read that again. Rather than simply identify the shortcomings of evolution, it confirms testable predictions that I made in the past, and it makes more falsifiable predictions for the future. Guess what? Guess what, guys? What he's saying is the more testable predictions that are confirmed based on predictions he made in the past have resorted to more future testable predictions. That is what I call an active research program, guys. So it's pretty well over for these evolutionists. Okay, they don't got much. I linked this article in the description box, so please check it out. You can watch the series. So here is the cold slabs. You can look at this, at the cold slabs I was talking about earlier. The cold slabs prediction that indicates a recent creation, recent global flood. And you can go and you can see the imaging process known as seismic tomography. Okay, that is actually revealed the dense rock at the bottom of the mantle, the much cooler temperature. Right here, cold subducted slabs are best explained by runaway subduction. And as I covered earlier, the catastrophic plate tectonic model suggests subduction during the flood year, and the fact that it occurred rapidly, right, with the plates moving at rates of meters per second. And then the evolutionary critics like speed of sound want to scoff, but then they have no way to explain the cold slabs that have not melted. And they're much cooler than the surrounding material. Exactly predicted by creationist geologists. So I just wanted to show you that one. And I have a couple clips I wanted to show you as well. And I was looking at the, let's see, check the comments real quick. Awesome. All you night party animals. Otangelo says, it's just a matter of time until everyone laughs at Darwin's theory. That's right. That's right, brother. Overturned. The gold standard of science. Testable and falsifiable predictions, and it's the creationists doing so. So we just hit the hour mark, and I've been talking nonstop. So I am going to, since there are a couple clips that I still want to show to complete this stream. We've talked about a lot, guys. I mean, we talked about evidence for accelerated nuclear decay. We've talked about evidence for catastrophic plate tectonics. We've talked about evidence for a young Earth. We talked about genetic related predictions. We've debunked the heck out of Dr. Dan Stern Cardinale and these critics. So there was a lot of information there packed into an hour. So I'm going to take a 2-minute break. And I want to show you guys a couple clips before I end this stream and I end this show tonight. I'm gonna go get a glass of water real quick. God bless you all. Even at close to 4:30 in the morning, it's awesome to see some of you in here because, as Otangelo said, it's just a matter of time before everybody's laughing at evolutionary theory and universal common ancestry. So I will be back. All right, guys. Break time is over. So I'm going to show a couple clips here before we call it a night. One clip of Dr. Jeanson himself talking about some of these testable predictions, as well as testable predictions when it comes to speciation rates and speciation since the flood, with some of those predictions even coming true and being confirmed since they were made. So it's not one or two predictions, guys. It's prediction after prediction after prediction. Okay. All of these predictions that the critics want to ignore. So I'm going to share screen again. This time I'm going to share the audio and share screen. Okay, here we go, guys. Share audio. Guys, let me know how the audio is coming in.
One of the main claims I put in the book is, look, here's for humans, for example, in African people groups, because no one has yet measured a particular type of DNA, the rate at which DNA mutates in certain African groups. I said, look, here's some numbers. They're gonna change their DNA at this many changes. This many changes in the book. That's something we can go and test. And what's been really looking at some of the evolutionary critics, there's been published rebuttals to the book, and when they do that chapter, and there's one in particular, and one of the evolutionary blogger who was saying, well, this is a problem, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. His main response to me putting a prediction in print and basically saying to evolutionists, now meet your own standard. You put a prediction in print. His basic response was, Jeanson doesn't get to pick which predictions we should put in print. I thought, well, I think I'm on the right track. To this one. That's one answer. The second answer, and these predictions are already true. So one of the predictions we can make, if you say, look, God created kinds of creatures. They're not species, they're not even the level of genus, but probably more the level of family. For example,
Yeah, George, it was on 1.5, so I'm going to put it down to 1.25.
everything from tigers to house cats are in the cat family. They descend from a pair on board the Ark of Noah, according to Scripture, and combine that with science. So there's over 30 species of cats alive today. That makes a prediction then that cats have been forming at a certain number of species per year, or it takes this many years to form a new species on average. That's the type of prediction you can make, and that whole model actually predicts species to continually form. This is something the evolutionists don't even see coming, because they think it takes millions of years for these species to come about. Well, lo and behold, about 4 months after my book came out, one of the most famous Exhibit A examples for evolution, Darwin's finches, those finches in the Galapagos that Peter and Rosemary Grant have been studying for 40 years, they announced in Science magazine, January of 2018, that they observed the formation of a new species of Darwin's finch. So you run the numbers, they were shocked by this, because it's supposed to take millions of years. They're shocked by this. You run the numbers, and the rate at which these species are forming, so if you take that observation, extrapolate it to the whole globe, what that translates to is at an average rate of 3 to 4 new bird species per year. If you run the numbers for young Earth creation, so there's around 11,000 total bird species on the planet today. There's about 4,500 years since the flood. So you say the bird species today come from the handful of bird kinds on board the Ark, 11,000 divided by 4,500. It gives you about 2 to 3 new species per year. So it's right in line with what young Earth creationists has predicted. So I'd say, first of all, answer that big 40-year-old question. You don't make testable predictions false, factually false. They're in print. They're in my book. And beyond that, and this again blows me away, they're already coming true. There's work I'm doing right now in human genetics. I said in the book we should be able to see the history of civilization written into our DNA. The transatlantic slave trade, Genghis Khan's empire, the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire. There should be signatures in our DNA of this. We're seeing that now come true, and hopefully some research that will be published this year shows that to be true. So not only is it factually an error, but the tables have been completely reversed. We're making predictions that are coming true, and I'm not seeing the evolutionists counter that with their own predictions, let alone ones that are coming true.
That's fantastic.
So right there at the end as well, you could hear him talk about those predictions when it comes to the history of civilization, genetic stance, but also predictions on what? That's right, speciation rates. Okay, we could go on and on about predictions when it comes to DNA function, okay, and these highly conserved mitochondrial DNA proteins, okay, that form nested hierarchical patterns. We're even making predictions when it comes to those types of DNA sequences, DNA proteins, DNA positions, okay? I mean, it's really become sad at how little of a rebuttal really or counter the evolutionists are making when it comes to this. So here's another short clip of Dr. Jeanson's prediction. I'm going to check the audio real quick from the phone, make sure everything's good. Okay. So, I definitely want to point out too that Dr. Ryan Hayes, Dr. James Carter, when they're on here last week, just absolutely demolished abiogenesis. Dr. James Tour is doing this irrefutable series, demolishing the critics, specifically Professor Dave. Okay. So when it comes to origins of life, I mean, they've got nothing, absolutely nothing. And anything they invoke results in chicken and egg problem after chicken and egg problem, which means, okay, our starting position of design diversity, created heterozygosity, okay, front-loaded capacity to adapt, okay, the fact that it makes these testable predictions that flow from the starting point, okay, makes it the much stronger, much more powerful explanation than the evolutionary community, which have no explanation for the origin of life. They have no testable predictions. Okay, they have no counter or rebuttal to the chicken and egg problems that we are all pointing out. Okay, that's why I always say it's the abiogenesis challenge, because they have no answer for it. So they'll often say, you know, the design diversity hypothesis is post hoc ad hoc, when they themselves can't provide any plausible alternative. And yet our starting point of design diversity and created heterozygosity makes testable predictions. That's the gold standard of science. Okay, so here we go, guys.
Have secrets that if you study them long enough, will be released. So let's start with one of those. One of the most fun facts, the groups within groups pattern of life. We'll look at an example from mitochondria, and specifically from mitochondrial DNA and mitochondrial proteins that it encodes. You can see in mitochondrial comparisons a groups within groups pattern. Here's an example from one of the papers I published. Along each of these axes, the y-axis and the axes, you have 2,700 animal species. So it's a highly zoomed out view of this. The red color represents sequences of high identity. The blue represents low identity. Thought I had my mouse, never mind. So anyway, you can see that the big red box there in the middle represents fish. They're more similar to each other than to anything else, and they differ from other species, but it's in one of the papers I published. So what's the explanation for this? And let's press the argument further, as many of my opponents have done. This is a particular mitochondrial DNA protein. We know the biochemical functions that they perform in the electron transport chain. Take the H synthase example. From a design perspective, why would the zebra ATP synthase proteins have sequence from the toucan, as an example? This is one of the arguments of the young Earth creationist view. From a design perspective, wouldn't you make them identical? In the fact that they're not, and in a groups within groups pattern would seem to argue that they share that the differences reflect time as common ancestor. And in this case, we're looking at zebras and birds. This would fit the evolutionary idea, not the young Earth creationist one. In this sense, revolution. Well, is this the only function the ATP synthase performs? There's a little known discovery that's been growing, and the numbers of these discoveries have been growing with time. It's this concept of protein multifunctionality. So here's some classic glycolysis enzymes, those enzymes involved in converting glucose to cellular energy currency. LDH there is lactate dehydrogenase. Well, you think these perform only one function in this particular pathway. They've also been found, lo and behold, nucleus acting as transcription factors. This has been a very surprising discovery. So to make a long story short, the evolutionary argument I just implicitly assumes that the differences don't have a function. What I did in this paper, and I have it in English because that's what it was published in, the paper was derived from first principles from a creationist of a testable prediction on mitochondrial DNA function. My prediction is that it's functional. The current data that do not resolve the question. It's a matter of future research. This is an example of something that future experiments could reveal to be true or false. So you start with the familiar, you study it to death in hopes that it'll yield some secrets. There's another element of biology that's relevant to our question. In a handful of species, the parent offspring mutation rates have been measured, and the answer that we've seen from these studies has been consistent. So this is one of an early.
So there's more testable predictions, as I was discussing earlier, when it comes to the nested patterns in DNA and these mitochondrial DNA proteins and the existence of protein multifunctionality in nuclear DNA proteins. Okay. We are taking that, Dr. Jeanson is taking that and making predictions on mitochondrial DNA proteins and predicting that these are there. The reason why they may form nested hierarchical patterns in DNA is for functional reasons, functional purposes. They may indeed be multifunctional in the same way that we see these nuclear DNA proteins that are multifunctional. This is called protein moonlighting, okay? So once again, another prediction that the evolutionists do not want to engage. Now, remember, these evolutionists shy away from making predictions on DNA function because they need to assume, like you hear Dr. Dan all the time talk about how the evidence suggests that the majority of our genome is non-functional, is junk DNA essentially, because they require, okay? They require evolutionary leftovers, genomic fossils, okay? They require that most of the genomes of living organisms are essentially neutral junk in order that these mutations that accumulate from generation to generation can hit those neutral junk areas and essentially be absorbed. And then they can be called upon through evolutionary advancement, okay? They can be called upon to essentially evolve new functions, okay? So they require lots of junk. But you won't see them put on paper, okay? Future testable predictions as to how much of the genome they predict will turn out to be functional. And you'll see them say that, okay, the evidence may suggest that most of the genome, 60 to 80%, is active. Okay, but a lot of this is spurious. A lot of this is not actually functional. And I always point out the fact that it would be wasteful. It would be wasteful of resources and energy for the cell to essentially deal with or replicate all of that useless junk. Okay, they want to tell us that a bacteria-like organism, okay, a single-celled-like organism evolved into a multi-celled organism, which evolved into a fish, which evolved into an amphibian, which evolved into a reptile, into a mammal, into a bird. Okay, another path would have evolved into humans, but essentially natural selection, though, could not have simply gotten rid of all this useless junk that's wasteful to the cell, wasteful of energy. Give me a break. Okay, it's evolutionary nonsense. It's not science. Okay. So they want to say that all of this phenotypic complexity, these novel body plans, this novel information, okay, the origin of all of these body plans, like we see in the Cambrian explosion, for example, came about through natural evolutionary processes, mutations, natural selection. But then they want to say that natural selection can't remove all of this junk. The reason why it's there is because it's not all junk. It's active and it's there for a reason, which is why creationists are making predictions, future testable predictions on DNA function. Hey, you knock this gene out, you're going to have this effect, or you mutate this specific DNA position, it may lead to this disease or that disease. Okay, these genetic sequences are functional for this reason or for this purpose. Prediction upon prediction, okay? We would predict that these pseudogenes or these endogenous retroviruses, these other classes of retrotransposons are there for a functional reason. Okay, these nested hierarchical patterns are there for functional purposes. Okay, it's by design, not by descent. All predictions that they hesitate to make. So this is going to be the last clip I show. Now, what this is my debate. I think it was like my fourth or fifth debate with RJ Downard, who supposedly has written a book called The Rocks Were There. He's fully up to date on all the young Earth creation literature. But yet, when I pressed him on these predictions, Okay. He knew nothing about him. He knew nothing about him. So I'm going to show you a clip from that debate where I brought up this specific prediction when it comes to the mitochondrial DNA proteins and DNA multi-functionality, okay, protein moonlighting. So, and you could see his response. He was dumbfounded. He'd never heard of it. So these critics are not up to date. And the ones that say they are up to date, like James Downer, they are not up to date. Okay. They're deceiving. So right here, once it loads, and you'll see James Downer had no idea about this prediction, just like they have no idea about the history of civilization predictions. They are behind on the times.
The specific prediction that Dr. Jeanson has made regarding the patterns found in the biological world.
The one that you have been repeating previously?
No, this
right?
is a different. No, this is
different
one
prediction. Tell us all about this prediction.
Okay, well, if you're looking at those net hierarchical patterns, and we're trying to say that patterns are there for functional purposes, are you familiar with these highly conserved proteins like the cytochrome C?
Yeah.
Okay, so why does, let's say, the CO1 gene, the cytochrome C, mitochondrial DNA protein, why, when you look at that genetically, why do they form nested hierarchical patterns? Why are there so many different
It's
variants?
impossible for them not to in a natural branching speciation.
Exactly. Doesn't that appear to be confirmation evidence for descent with modification? Because the human, all humans, how similar is the human and chimp cytochrome C mitochondrial DNA protein?
Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Well, it's very similar. And then the further you can go to the old world monkeys, you can go down to dogs, cats, fish. Those nested hierarchical patterns exist. So my question is, I guess if you don't know, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson has made a prediction as to why the differences exist, differentiating between nested patterns from common descent and nested patterns from function. So are you familiar with protein moonlighting, multifunctionality in these nuclear DNA proteins?
The term is vaguely familiar, but I don't know right off the bat on it.
I did show a paper. So mitochondrial proteins now have, it's kind of like a multifunctional tool. They're doing, they're involved in not just obviously protein related function, but information flow and metabolic optimization, for example. So Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson is making predictions that these highly conserved mitochondrial DNA proteins, such as the cytochrome C, that form these nested hierarchical patterns that seem to look like descent with modification, he's saying that those as well are multifunctional. Now, we don't have data to confirm this yet. Those tests haven't been done. So therefore, that is a novel prediction that can help us understand, is this descent with modification, or are these patterns reflective of, and I can send you that paper too.
I would love to just make sure that I don't already have it in the data field. Apparently, you're going to mitochondria a lot. Hopefully, we can to mammoths and the Native Americans and those too.
No, I'm just showing you because you brought up the fact that creationists ignore the data field, and you always talk about Todd Wood and Kurt Wise. Todd Wood looks at morphology and anatomy, and Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson disagrees with that because, like I said, well, I don't want to repeat myself, why bones are inconsistent. You can look to convergent evolution, for example.
You will.
So they look to molecular clocks and DNA function. That's why the ALUs you talk about, or the ERVs, for example, the fact that they're highly functional DNA elements, that's certainly consistent with this model of, as you love to hear and you say, created heterozygosity.
When
How do you
can we
explain that?
expect?
Okay, here I'm going to share screen one more time, guys. And so we're going on about an hour and a half now. Just 1 second. It may lag for 1 second. Bear with me, guys. It may be briefly frozen.
Doesn't that appear to be
All right, guys, let me know if you can hear me now. My computer froze out on me there, but I restarted it, refreshed it. The reason why it was laggy there, Jesus is Lord, is because for that few minutes I wasn't even in the stream. So I rebooted it, and somehow the actual stream didn't shut down. So that's pretty cool. So I wanted to point out that so that it's been about an hour and a half for anybody who just joined us. Looks like people are getting up and getting ready for work. Brother Neff's probably got a nice hot pot of coffee waiting for him, and I know that's the best part of my day. So we've been going an hour and a half. We started off with evidence for accelerated nuclear decay. I also debunked the so-called heat problem. Went over evidence for catastrophic plate tectonics, as well as fulfilled and confirmed predictions from the flood model. And then we covered Dr. Dan Stern Cardinale and his claims, his erroneous claims that creationists such as Dr. Jeanson are not testing their predictions. We demolished that argument and went into some other predictions on DNA function and demonstrated that the best of the critics are just not up to date on the data. So I would say that they have run out essentially of arguments. Okay. So good to see everybody in the chat, but yes, I try to keep this about an hour and a half. So definitely, if you haven't seen the beginning of this stream, check it out. Lots of good information. What I'll say before I shut it down, guys, is this week, make sure you're here Thursday. We've got Joseph Hubbard back on. Friday, we've got Battle of the Neffs, round 2 on the global flood, Nephilim Free versus David Neff. And March 3rd as well, we just confirmed Derek Barnes versus Matt Slick on morality. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Lots to look forward to, guys. I hope you enjoyed the stream. And we will see you probably tomorrow. And of course on Thursday for a Q&A with Joseph Hubbard. Okay, guys. God bless. Everybody have a good night. And SFT is out.